I want to ask you about some of the fundamental differences between the uprising in 79 and what's happening today. Some people in the West may think that they're quite a bit more similar than they actually are. Obviously, one of the fundamental differences being the theocratic element. But maybe you could expound.
I think it's just the converse to it. It's just this is a course correction to 1979. It's of the same level of significance. I mean, it's that big of a deal. I just think it's a course correction. It's like they went this way, and now it's trying to realign for a lot of those for a lot of those mistakes that took place in 1979. Yeah. I think that it's also important to understand. I want to go back to ancient history and just expound a bit on the mythical Islamic Golden Age that took place. And this, I refer to it as a hugely consequential and insidious form of cultural appropriation, because I see this all the time in the American modern left, where they'll post about how, isn't it great? Look at all these Islamic scientists, these Muslim scientists who contributed to the sciences and contributed to humanity, during Islamic civilization. All of them were Persian. Al-Farabi was Persian. Ibn Sina was Persian. Al-Khwarizmi was Persian. These were guys who were forced to write, by and large, were forced to write in Arabic. And they wrote these, many of them wrote paeans in the beginning of their treatises to Muhammad. Why do you think they did that? You want to venture to guess why someone who's not genuinely religious in this political context might write something like that in the beginning of his book? Would you like to guess?
I can guess, but I don't want to be inaccurate.
Obviously, it was under force. I mean, Islam has a never-ending willingness to use violence in pursuit of expansion
Jihad.
And martyrdom.
Right.
Sorry?
Jihad.
Yeah. So, Islam is very clear. The verses of the Quran are very clear about what to do with infidels. The one verse that what I'm going to say our Muslim apologists or Islam apologists quote is that there's no compulsion in Islam. That's the one verse that they can quote on this particular issue of freedom of thought and freedom to enter and leave a religion. That's not saying that someone who apostates should not be compelled. Apostates are very clearly meant to be put to death unless they immediately recant. I mean, the Islam, which is essentially a text of laws, of legal verses mostly, there's 500 legal verses. It's very clear about what to do with infidels and what to do with apostates. I mean, people of Abrahamic religions, Jews and Christians, are accepted. I mean, they're not to be beheaded, essentially. But they're also, as you know, forced to pay the jizya, too. So they're essentially reduced to positions of near servitude, while Islam, according to the Quran, is in a constant state of expansion.
And to be clear there quickly, the jizya is a taxed to non-believers.
Yeah, it's extortion. It's extortion.
You also don't seem to need even a Quranic example to show the expansion of Islam and how quickly it's done it. And it seems to me that it's indicative of something inherently conquering or having the need to conquer in Islam that's different from many other religions, that where the proof is shown in the pudding, which is 1,400 years and a subcontinent dominated. And 2 billion followers.
Look at India, which had to be split off and become Pakistan too, where the Muslims had to go to Pakistan. It's not a nice history. It's plainly not. But so I think the reason this is so consequential, and I really do think of this as the Golden Age as a form of cultural appropriation. The reason this is important is when I keep hearing know-nothing American leftists, crow about how great the Islamic Golden Age was, it always comes with this implication that we ought to embrace the spread of Islam as this sort of benevolent thing that eventually perhaps the world will unite under this banner.
Well, maybe I can touch on something quickly there that may be going through their minds as a Westerner.
I just want to say, Taylor, that it's the exact opposite is true. It is not true. It is not the case that we ought to welcome the Islamization of France and of Germany. If you want to understand the real canary in a coal mine, if Americans want to understand the real canary in a coal mine for the spread of Islam, it's not France and Germany right now. It's Iran. You should look to Iran and what has happened with Iran with the imposition of Islam and the cultural appropriation of brilliant Persian thinkers and scientists who genuinely did contribute to mathematics and to medicine in huge ways. A lot of that took place in Iran, and I just want to say, I mean, you can see it today too. You know, I'm sorry that some of this reality is somewhat politically incorrect, but the reason we can't have political correctness is because the truth is generally an awful thing. You have to be willing to state some plain truths here, and the truth here is that, in terms of their contributions, there's no doubt that Iranians have contributed more than Arabs have, without a doubt, than Muslim Arabs have. Now, you did have Christian Arabs at the same time in some of these houses where they were developing mathematics too. I don't want to deny that, but in the final analysis, and one of the ways you can look at it is just look at all the, top-rate universities in Iran today, and look at their engineering schools. I mean, Tehran University, Azadi University, Sharif University, University of Shiraz. These are big universities and all their faculty do research. I mean, they're not just sitting there pontificating. They do real research there too. Even today, even despite the tragedy in Iran, the political tragedy in Iran, even today they're doing research.
Is there a noticeable difference?
Taylor, you can look, or just look at the faculty boards. I mean, just do a casual look. Your viewers should do a look look to a major university. Just spend a couple of them and see if you look on the engineering boards and see if you notice some Iranian names there too. You will.
Is there a noticeable output of a noticeable difference in literature output from pre-Islamic Iran and post-Islamic Iran? Because I know that one statistic I've heard not too long ago is that there have been more books written and translated into English, written by Spanish authors from the country of Spain in the last 50 years than have been done in the Islamic world, or at least in the Arabian Peninsula, in the last 1,000 years.
By and large, I mean, they don't contribute very many patents either. They're not really a part of this global thinking superorganism in a way. I mean, I was just going to finish my point to say, I mean, like, compare this to Saudi Arabia. What universities do they have doing real research? I mean, or maybe you could find one, very little, but there's clearly an asymmetry here. And this is not even taking into consideration the brain drain, the huge brain drain that's taking place in Iran, where the elites of Iran, many of them, I know a lot of them too, but many of them who left the country in 1979. So this is another one of the tragedies where your human capital in Iran, as a result of politics, ended up depriving the country of some of their greatest thinkers.
As far as cultural appropriation goes, one thing I wanted to mention was that my notion for quite some time and up until recently was a conflation between Islam and Persian culture and history, and the inability or lacking of knowledge that would allow me to differentiate, just the lacking of knowledge that would allow me to differentiate between the two. So I would see movies like Aladdin. Of course, it seems sophomoric and silly, but you would think that they're the same. So I'm glad you can educate me and possibly some of my uninformed audience members on the history and the differences and the dates specifically.
Yeah, dude, this is a really big deal with the stuff we're talking about. These are a lot of, to be honest, a lot of what I'm saying are dangerous ideas at the same time, which is partly why they end up getting suppressed.
I won't bring up Aladdin again, by the way. I'm sorry.
Part of it is just that because this stuff is foreign, Americans need a simplistic narrative. And at the same time, some of it these are genuinely dangerous ideas that we're talking about.
I'm also glad we're doing a longer form interview to fully elaborate on the subject. When you watch Fox or CNN or whatever, you're getting little sound bites, and that's if they're talking on the subject at all in the first place.
Yeah. And a lot of the people that I mean, I watch and read a ton of the news related to Iran too, and in the American press, I mean, a lot of the people who end up commenting have their own vested interests as well, and it's not aligned with what the protesters on Iran want. I'm aligned with the protesters, very actively so. I'm absolutely aligned with the protesters. They should be supported. We should maybe talk a little bit about the protests.
Yeah, let's talk about exactly what some of the protesters want, and how. I'd also like to know if the mainstream media is suppressing the real numbers on how many revolutionaries there actually are in Iran, and so forth.
Well, you've got at least 3,700 people arrested. A handful or so. I mean, tens killed, let's say, probably 40 killed, 50 killed, and a few killed in prison too. They were likely tortured to death. So what we're seeing right now is Iranians willing to die. I mean, we know that the regime is willing to kill. That I already knew. In 2009, you had the Green Movement, which most people in America will remember because that was such a big international story. That was very different than what we see today. Very different. What we saw in 2009 was a movement rejecting the results of an election. And so it was entirely within that constitutional order. They just didn't like the results of the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad winning. And it was led by two of the participants in the presidential election, Karoubi and Mir Hussein Mousavi, both of whom are totally committed to the principles of the Islamic Republic. I mean, yeah, they're more on the pragmatic or reformist side, but I mean, no doubt about it, they're still committed to the Islamic Republic. And at that time, Iranians were not willing to die for this. I mean, everyone saw that viral video of Neda Aga Sultan being shot and dying in the street. Some of it was questioned too, but in any case, let's say one person died, a few people died. You didn't have tens of people dying at that time. Right now, Iranians are willing to die, and that's a big deal too. Because if they're willing to kill and you're not willing to die, then it's just do the math and see where you're going to end up. The regime wins. But in this case, this is much more significant. It's taking place in disparate cities across the country. It's not just in Tehran. It's in a lot of places that haven't traditionally seen protests also. And the slogans are much more subversive than what we saw in 2009. The centralized, consolidated slogan in 2009 was, "Where is my vote?"
And what was Ahmadinejad's role in place in all of this, especially if he was a name in the West?
Ahmadinejad is really interesting, and it's going to be a little bit difficult for an American audience who have casually followed this stuff to stomach, because when Ahmadinejad was in power until 2013, Americans will recall him for his mostly bombastic statements at the UN General Assembly, his speech at Columbia in which he said, Iran doesn't have gays the way you do. So Ahmadinejad is kind of almost like a cartoon character in some ways. He's a populist. He's surely a populist who wanted to bring projects to rural areas and wanted to give out more subsidies to rural areas as well. And during his second term, he became more autonomous, which is not good within the constitutional order of the Islamic Republic, which really has the president clearly deferential towards the supreme leader. And Ahmadinejad wanted to kind of run his own foreign policy, which is usually not the purview of the president. And he's managed to be a bit of a shapeshifter in some ways, because he was just arrested about a week ago, and he is one of this movement that I'm describing to you involves a lot of people connecting around ideas, essentially forming what I call a superorganism. And we're centralized around these ideas of Iranian nationalism, and centralized around these ideas of connecting Iran's pre-Islamic past with its post-Islamic future. We don't see the imposition of Islam in the 7th century as something to be celebrated in Iran. We see it as a tragedy, as an absolute tragedy that needs to be corrected. And in that sense, we see the Islamic Republic as just the most politically manifest form of that tragedy. So, where was I going with this?
Maybe you could talk a bit about
I want to finish this on Ahmadinejad. Okay. So there are people. This is important. I know there are people within the government and within the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps of the Islamic Republic, which is kind of the elite militia unit that's loyal to the supreme leader. There are Confederates within the government and the IRGC who are on board with this project as well. They see the Islamic Republic essentially in a very perilous state. They think it has not delivered results for the people. They think the entire establishment is corrupt, and it is. They see the entire establishment as inept, and it is. And yet they don't want a wholesale revolution that is going to completely upend Iran's industrial and economic order, because the IRGC has tentacles throughout Iran's entire economy, throughout telecommunications, throughout construction firms, hospitals, charitable organizations. Much of it is run by the IRGC. And if we were to uproot the entire order and disband the IRGC, Iran would have to be rebuilt from scratch. So I don't think that that's what we want either. So there's certain structures of the Islamic Republic that will need to be maintained, and yet we need fundamental changes taking place at the same time, including no more supreme leader. He'll be gone. And these types of changes will only be able to be enacted under martial law. So this is ultimately going to culminate in some kind of military coup taking place, in which either one commander or a group of commanders at the opportune time seize power and impose martial law and start a series of fundamental changes to the Islamic Republic, which will in effect no longer be an Islamic Republic eventually. It'll be an Iranian nationalist government, one of which will be ending the office of the supreme leader, one of which will be reforming the role of the Guardian Council, which is a 12-member body responsible for vetting all candidates for elected office, virtually all candidates for elected office, obviously including the president, and vetting all legislation to ensure that it is consistent with the principles of the Islamic Republic. And when they vet presidential candidates, they're not vetting them to make sure that they're in the interests of the Iranian nation. They're vetting them to make sure that they're committed to the principles of the Islamic Republic and that they're pious Muslims. So that will need to be reformed as well. So big changes are going to be coming to Iran in the coming months and years, and it's ultimately going to be hugely in the favor of Iran and hugely in the favor of Western Europe and the United States as well. Now, there are pitfalls involved here too. As with any major change like this, there are external players who wish to channel it toward their own interests. I have no doubt about that. And some of those interests I can't get on board with. The Trump administration right now is considering various plans for what to do to Iran. They were totally taken by surprise. That's why as were the Israelis, that's why when Ayatollah Khamenei, during his Friday sermon last week, naturally his excuse is always, whenever uprisings take place, his excuse is, these are foreign agents, they're agitated by the West, by Israel, by the United States, by Saudi Arabia. They don't have our interests, they're not real Iranians. That's not the case here. The United States was taken totally by surprise, and Israel was taken by surprise. Mossad, the Israeli intelligence unit, had no idea that this was going to be happening. Now, that said, once they get the ball moving, all these forces want to take it in their direction, because Iran is a huge geostrategic asset. Huge. So some of the Trump administration's plans are going to include a military intervention, which I will never get on board on. I will never, pretty much under any circumstances, support a military intervention of Iran, much like I protested the Iraq War of 2003 and opposed the Libya aerial bombing. These things don't go well, and Iran has a very potent rally around the flag effect, just like Americans do too. I mean, even if Americans were hugely divided over their government, dislike the government, they're not going to side with outsiders coming in and and invading the country. That's just not going to happen. So you're actually going to strengthen the Islamic Republic if you invade. So you can't do that. Some sort of CIA covert operation is probably being considered right now as well. But ultimately, I think that the best thing that Americans can do is let the process play itself out, because there is a cosmically significant contradiction between Iran's Persian ethos and its the Islamic religion that was imposed in the 7th century. That contradiction has always existed with all its flashpoints, and it's playing itself out today. Ultimately, the civilization is going to win over Islam, and we're going to see first a political change in the form of the government, and then the longer term change is going to be a socio-cultural change that will be probably beyond my lifetime, of replacing the predominantly Shia Islamic religion in Iran with something that is, connects Iran's pre-Islamic past with its post-Islamic future. The best role that Americans can play in that is to let it play out, but also keep your eyes on Iran. Pay a lot of attention to Iran. It's so funny. Sometimes I think, like, we have these events, these unstable events take place in foreign countries, and one of our immediate thoughts is, oh, should we bomb it? Should we invade? Rather than do that, how about just pay a lot of attention? Let's start with that first. Let's just pay a lot of attention. And we kind of have the ability to do it now with the internet too. All these videos are getting out. I see them in all these apps that I'm on. I see all these videos spreading, and they make it eventually on Twitter. They make it on Facebook eventually and on YouTube. But just pay attention. Rather than get involved militarily, pay a lot of attention. And I got to say this too: in 2009, when the Green Movement took place, I was following the Green Movement very closely. I was working for CBS News at the time. The Green Movement lasted some 2 weeks or so, and the American media was paying a ton of attention to it. It was the A1 lead story every night until Michael Jackson died. When Michael Jackson died, all of a sudden, that story got pushed further and further back into the evening news, further back on the pages of the New York Times. And this is really important, especially because the Soviet refusenik, his name's Natan Sharansky, he's still alive today in Israel. One of the things he said is that when you're protesting against an autocratic regime, you want to know that the outside world is hearing you. That's very important. If you don't think that they're hearing you, then it feels like you're a tree that falls in the forest. So if we can send a signal that we hear the Iranians on the streets and that we side with them and their aspirations for a great Iran, I think that's a very important role that we can play. And that doesn't cost millions and millions of dollars, and it's not going to tear up a bunch of lives.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button down below. Leave a comment in the comment section if you can. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.